Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us, everybody. I am Maureen Ryan. I am the Deputy Director of the Center for 21st Century Studies at UW-Milwaukee. And we are so pleased to have everybody here today for our conversation with Stacy Alaimo, Jennifer Gabrys, and Frédéric Keck. This is part of our Long 2020 project, which we'll be doing programming for throughout the spring semester. We have a lot of really fabulous interdisciplinary conversations lined up. This is the first. I'm very pleased to have all of you with us, and especially our esteemed panelists. I will just take a moment to give you some sense of like what the logistics are of this event. So you are able to, so if you're attending in Zoom, you can leave a question at any point that you're curious. You know, if it comes to you in the moment while people are talking, you can leave a question in the Q&A. I believe there's both a chat function and a Q&A, but to make things a little, more streamlined, I'm going to be looking at the Q&A for questions. And we'll get to a point, after each presenter has spoken, that we'll want to draw in those questions and bring them into the conversation. So that's, so if you have a question, please leave it there. If anybody out there is watching on YouTube, because we're streaming live to YouTube as well, you can leave a comment in the YouTube Q&A. I'll be checking there periodically too. So that's how you can get in touch. And what we're aiming to do is have each panelist talk for about 10 minutes. And then we'll have a discussion with Richard Grusin, the center director, whom I'm about to turn the mic over to in a moment. And then we'll have just discussion among us, and we'll go for about 90 minutes or sooner. We'll end sooner if it seems like that's the natural thing to do. So very briefly, I'll just introduce our speakers. First, we have Stacy Alaimo, who is a professor of English and environmental studies at the University of Oregon. She teaches across the environmental humanities, science studies, animal studies, American literature, cultural studies, and critical theory, focusing more specifically on developing models of new materialism, material feminisms, environmental justice, and most recently, the blue humanities. Her books include Exposed, Environmental Politics and Pleasures in Posthuman Times, Bodily Natures, Science, Environment, and the Material Self, and Undomesticated Ground, Recasting Nature as Feminist Space. So Jennifer Gabrys is chair in Media, Culture, and Environment in the Department of Sociology at Cambridge University. She leads the Planetary Praxis Group and is principal investigator on the ERC-funded project Smart Forests, Transforming Environments into Social Political Technologies. She also leads the Citizen Sense and AirKit projects, which investigate the use of environmental sensors for new modes of citizen involvement in environmental issues. Jennifer is the author of How to Do Things with Sensors, Program Earth, Environmental Sensing Technology and the Making of a Computational Planet, and Digital Rubbish, A Natural History of Electronics. And third, Frédéric Keck is Director of Research at the Laboratory of Social Anthropology at the Collège de France, I believe, although your title has many acronyms in it, so please correct me if that is not the right affiliation. His recent research involves the history of social anthropology and contemporary biopolitical questions raised by avian influenza. His publications include Avian Reservoirs, Virus Hunters and Birdwatchers in Chinese Sentinel Posts, Un Monde Grippe, terrible French accent, I apologize, Lucien Lévy-Bruhl in Entrée Philosophie et Anthropologie, and Claude Lévi-Strauss, Une Introduction. So those are our panelists, and I'll leave it to Richard now to kind of introduce what we'll be doing today.
I think Maureen did a pretty good job, but I thought maybe I would say first, welcome everybody, and explain maybe a little bit about how we got to the Long 2020 as a topic. A lot of you know that C21 featured in the Before Times, an annual conference in the spring, and that really the annual conference Stacy participated in. One of them, Anthropocene Feminism, and it's really one of the highlights of the year for us, both for the event itself, because it really brings together a lot of people from diverse disciplines, different stages of their career in what we think is a really welcoming and open environment, and people really, I think, have a good time and share a lot of really interesting ideas. Sadly, of course, we can't really do in-person conference, and we weren't crazy about doing an online conference over an extended period of time. It just seemed like too much. And so we were trying to figure out how to deal with that. The other half of the conference is that our tradition is, for most of them, to edit a volume that is drawn from expanded versions of the keynote lectures and some selected pieces from other contributors. And we kind of, last year we had to cancel our conference that was planned on Alt-MKE for the spring. And this year, without a conference, we were kind of missing the opportunity to do a volume or to do something extended. So with that, it occurred to us that the cause of this absence was, in fact, the long 2020, or at least in part, part of the long 2020, the pandemic that's affected all of us. And so we decided to propose, in consultation with University of Minnesota Press, who edits our volumes, propose a volume of essays of shorter pieces. And I think they'll be more diverse generically, perhaps, than usual. Some will be more personal and informal. Some will be more traditional academic essays, and some all sorts of things in between. And from that, we've invited panelists who are interested, or contributors who are interested, to participate in these panels. This is a great panel for us to kick off the series, because we've been concerned with questions of environment, climate, extinction, the Anthropocene, really since for much of the past decade. And two conferences and volumes that emerged from that were Anthropocene Feminism, as I mentioned, and then After Extinction in the following year. So this is a really nice way for us to reprise some of those concerns, which have, those aren't the only places we've been addressing those issues. Many of our speakers have done that throughout the year. So that's about all I would like to say. And people will speak for about 10 minutes. And as Maureen said, you can put questions in the chat at any time, or in the Q&A function, I suppose, either way. All right, thanks all. And Stacy, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. And thank you to Maureen and Richard for putting this together. I'm really excited to see what everyone's going to come up with on the long 2020. It's a fabulous topic. I'd also like to thank Priscilla Ibarra, because we talked a lot early on about how our work shed light on 2020. And I'd like to mention an essay that's already written that's really good. It's by Bjorn Christensen, and it talks about transcorporeality and COVID. So you can look that up if you'd like. And also thanks to all of the invisible people out there for coming. We can see your names, but we can't see you. So it's kind of a strange situation. So I have some rather half-baked and overcooked reflections about ontoepistemologies, the inseparability of knowing and being, and also science and speculative practices. So when news of the impending pandemic hit, the most mundane activities, of course, suddenly became straight out of Ulrich Beck's Risk Society. All of us needed scientific mediation to try to figure out the most basic things, like can you touch your mail? Can you eat food that has come from the grocery store if it's frozen? All of those sorts of things. Can you go on a walk? And as an environmentalist who avoids toxins, I was completely unprepared for the frenzy of disinfecting. I didn't have one toxic chemical in my house or hand sanitizer. So I was completely unprepared. And yet I felt like I was completely prepared for the sense of things that this pandemic brought about. In the sense of having inhabited environmental conceptions of living as an embodied being, inextricably interconnected with larger material, economic, and political forces. Feminist, environmentalist, and new materialist theories all shift us toward these onto-epistemologies in which knowing and being are not divided. And I remember vivid sort of onto-epistemological moments, which early on when we didn't know that objects couldn't transmit the disease, if I touched something, my hands would start feeling tingly until I scrubbed them, like they knew, like something was wrong, something had to be done. It became a whole immersive way of being early on, very vivid. So the pandemic seemed both novel and utterly familiar as it epitomized my theory of transcorporeality as an onto-epistemological recognition or a material subjectivity in which knowing and being cannot be disentangled from each other or from the substances and places in which we are immersed. Transcorporeality expands the ethical and political terrains with the practice of speculating about long chains of interconnection, tracing not only individual risks, but responsibilities within networks of human and more than human harm. So while my book, Bodily Natures, Science, Environment, and the Material Self, focused on xenobiotic chemicals and not viruses, the parallels to the COVID crisis have felt rather eerie, especially for those of us who are chemically sensitive and who must constantly assess risks of invisible hazards, such as air freshener or cleaning chemicals in public spaces. So one of my questions here is whether this epistemological moment will shift our sense of things or not. So in the before times, it was normal for privileged people to live with a comforting disconnect between knowing and being. A conventional sense of well-being within capitalist consumerism actually requires ignorance and denial. Extractivism, objectification, and division are naturalized in the basic routines of everyday life and the conception of the separate self. The domestic realm is literally walled off from the long trail of interconnected harms to local or distant peoples and ecologies that maintain it. Start with anything, obviously your cell phone, and trace all of the harms. COVID both ruptured that norm and reinforced it. It interrupted expectations that constant streams of consumer goods would flow into our homes as toilet paper disappeared, and people reckoned with the meaning of supply chains. And when meat was not abundantly available in American grocery stores, perhaps some people reckoned with the suffering of the workers, if not the suffering of the animals themselves. And then, of course, we absolutely could have predicted, based on a lot of things that I've worked on, that in the face of this in this masked face of interconnection and vulnerability, a panicked reaction of aggressive hyper-individualism and domination would arise. The racist and the anti-maskers, like the climate deniers, and most vividly the rolling coal movement, refuse risk society, scientific mediation, and corporeal vulnerability in brutal and often racist displays. So thinking with the provocation of the long 2020, in the wake of debates about the Anthropocene, new materialism, and posthumanism, means that we need to reckon with the delusional figure of that separate, bounded, and transcendent human of Western capitalism, that floating apparition of reason and spirit, untethered to the earth, unrelated to any other form of life. Instead, of course, 2020 sharply illustrates the most basic ecological notion of interrelation, the indigenous ideas of profound relationality, and the recognition that the mastery of the world as dead resource must give way to material agencies and multi-species liveliness. And I think what happened is that there's a sense of epistemological rupture that happened in 2020. And to me, it's both about surprise and sedimentation. Sedimented because, say, the histories and current inequalities of racism became embodied, or were already embodied, but were shown to be embodied by the fact that the rates of death and disease were so much higher. So it shows like something like racism is not this sort of abstract social calculus or bias or even only an economic issue, but a sort of corporeal strata that then intersected with COVID. And then also surprising, because even though I feel like I am up on a lot of environmental issues, and actually every single day I'm concerned about so many different environmental issues, a global pandemic was not the thing that I thought would happen. I thought a lot of other things would happen, and they are happening, but the pandemic was, to me, a surprise. I did not think very much about the wildlife trade. And so there is that element of surprise, but then also other impending surprises that will also be happening. Michael Taussig describes this political moment. He says, "We seem stuck in a nightmare we cannot express." And I think that while it may be difficult to express this nightmare, there's a more paradoxical sense in which, with each disturbing event of 2020, from the continual, seemingly unstopping killing of unarmed Black people by police, to the unequal distribution of pandemic harm, to the devastation of the wildfires in the West and the apocalyptic winter in Texas, all of it seems like it's something we already knew. These events shock us, unmoor us, provoke outrage, but they've also been expected. And you may have noticed this on social media. I saw so many social media skirmishes that kind of went like this. So somebody would express a flash of sudden realization, a sense of outrage, a sense this is not reality, it can't be reality, it's not acceptable as reality. Then they were met by a chorus of frustrated, weary, sometimes virtue signaling people saying, "But we already know this, we've known this, we knew it, why didn't you know it? Why doesn't anyone know anything?" And this sort of thing happened with event after event. And it's as if coming to terms with the long 2020 means we know and we don't know, we expect it, yet we're shocked. We keep pivoting back and forth between these recognitions, scale shifting, connecting, speculating about what is and what could be. And I think that there's something wrong in which we're inhabiting knowledge. Okay, I think that that's one of the problems here. Like, we're not, the notion of onto-epistemology is something we have to think more about, because knowledge is clearly something we put out here and it comes up, but we have a sense that it has nothing to do with us really in any kind of real way. And then I think 2020, helpfully perhaps, was a kind of epistemic rupture where these things broke into our houses and our homes and our everyday life and disrupted us. And that could be a good thing. Okay, I'm at 9 minutes. So I'm going to quickly say, I think I made the point about needing to connect some of these things. But I think we also need, in the face of all the science deniers, we need a more complicated sense of science from science studies. So something like Robert Proctor's title, "Cancer Wars: Why Politics Shapes What We Know and Don't Know About Cancer." We need to keep remembering that we can't just revert back to just facts. Like, okay, those people don't believe in scientific facts, we believe in scientific facts. We have to make it a little more complicated than that. And we need an activist science, and we need to speculate with science to make all sorts of things, to bring them into the moment, to make them seem real. The speculation needs to be lived, present, real, immediate, not merely fictional, not otherworldly, but of this world. And those sorts of speculating backwards on the long 2020 in terms of its many causes and how they are all interconnected and interrelated, I think is important. But I think we also really have to speculate forward into a kind of sense of the futures that are already here, with climate change, with plastic pollution and ocean ecologies that are on the verge of collapse, and with so many other issues. They're already here, yet we're not living as if they are already here. And so there has to be some kind of connection between all that. I'm out of time, but if I weren't, I would talk about speculative design, drawing on Arturo Escobar, and saying how I've thrown myself into planting for other species to try to use my yard as a way to keep insects and birds alive. And I better stop because I'm anxious for the discussion and I don't want to go over my time. Thanks.
Thanks. Cheers, Jennifer.
Okay, thanks. Well, thanks also to Richard and Maureen for organizing this. And it's great to have a chance to have this conversation as part of the process of writing this contribution for the Long 2020 collection. So as part of the conversation today, I want to think about breathing in the Long 2020 through 3 particle stories: an airborne virus, particulate matter, and wildfire smoke. So I think there'll be many resonances across my talk and Stacy's, and perhaps with Frédéric as well. But more than ever, the atmospheres of 2020 have circulated and recirculated with the residues of viruses and aerosols, air pollution and wildfires, as well as the debris of burning cities and tear gas. How might it be possible to sample this material archive in the making, to sift through the sediments that are now passing through lungs, bodies, environments, and jet streams? What practices of breathability settle in and attempt to work through these particles? So in relation to this topic of the Long 2020, I engage specifically with breath as an articulation of duration. But breathing is not simply a moment of drawing air in and out, but is also an accumulation that informs and changes bodies and environments. It is a process that inherits atmospheric sedimentations and through exchange, changes them. And I craft these particle stories against the backdrop of a nearly decade-long research project, now Citizen Sense, where we have been working with citizens to monitor air pollution, document particulate matter levels, hence my ongoing interest in particles, and in so doing, to work toward more breathable worlds. We've focused on particulate matter, especially since this is a very hazardous pollutant, and also because it is less extensively monitored within regulatory monitoring networks. So here I want to consider what surfaces in practices of detecting and tuning into particles, and how might particles also allow us to understand the relational and world-making exchanges of breath. So particle 1, airborne virus. I begin this 3-part exploration here, first by considering, of course, COVID. This microscopic virus particle is only 1/8 of 1 micron, or 0.125 microns in size. It's more than 700 times smaller than a grain of sand. Similar to all particles that are 5 microns or smaller in size, this spiky particle can remain airborne for indefinite periods of time in most indoor environments, settling on surfaces and lodging in the respiratory tracts of humans and other mammals. Any particle smaller than 10 microns can be inhaled, and so a particle as small as the COVID virus is easily respirable. COVID particles are then airborne, transmitting indoors, attacking respiratory systems, causing shortness of breath, and X-ray scans of COVID patients show a kind of glassy confusion tearing through organs that would usually filter air and sustain bodies. So here is a particle that proliferates to decimate the pathways and processes for exchanging air, for breathing, and for being in proximity with other bodies. But these particles do not descend as some cosmic dust transported from another planet. Instead, they are a register of our exchanges with environments that are undergoing catastrophic decimation and change. With altered land use, warming climates, and shifting habitats, certain organisms and microbes are able to proliferate and create new patterns of infection and disease. So here, breathing is not merely a process of atomized bodies inhaling and exhaling abstract, if infectious, volumes of air, but rather is a lived material process that registers the exchanges across plants, animals, microbes, chemicals, and ecosystems that make breathing possible. The likely movement of a virus across environments, organisms, humans, travelways, and even circuits of commerce is then a further indication of how these exchanges generate relations that can more or less sustain breathability. And while COVID has, of course, transformed ways of life, as we've heard, it has impacted Black and Brown people, frontline workers, and people living in conditions of economic inequality and deprivation at significantly higher levels. In the UK, the first obituaries and photos of health workers killed by COVID documented this undeniable fact that many of the people suffering the severest effects from this viral particle were already enduring the interminable stress of inequality. They were not able to breathe in yet another sense of being able to extend within and through worlds of equity, justice, and livability. So that brings me to Particle 2, thinking about particulate matter. But I do this through the plea, I can't breathe, which is cut through and defined the long 2020 in yet another way. And here, ash from burning buildings drifted from the skies in the first instance of Minneapolis, and then other cities across the US, as fallout from the murder of George Floyd by police officers who violently extracted his breath, but who also had already been extracting his breath for an even longer duration than this moment in 2020. I can't breathe is the same phrase enunciated in 2014 by Eric Garner that became a recurring phrase and demand throughout the Black Lives Matter movement and protests that continue to ask how it could be possible not to suffocate the lives of so many Black, Brown, and poor people, and how it might also be possible to make more breathable worlds. As ash and particles rained down from the skies of cities on fire during the summer of 2020, they carried this charge. Thickening and acrid urban atmospheres were a register of the unbreathability of racial, economic, and social inequality. They were also a displacement and a reminder of the ongoing conditions of racial, social, economic, as well as environmental injustice that contribute to the toxic and polluted atmospheres that are typically experienced by people living in low-income communities. And this is a connection that Lindsay Dillon and Julie Z have also investigated in their study of particulate matter and police violence. So in many ways, this rain of particles coming down on burning cities was a displacement and a relocation of the violence that had been usually overlooked and created unbreathable conditions. Of course, particulate matter in the form of air pollution is usually within the range of 1 to 10 microns in size, so significantly larger than a COVID virus. And it's typically suspended and settled as one register of these conditions of inequality and injustice in cities around the world where people are having their breath cut short by pollution, where environmental injustice and inequality is experienced both every day through attempts to live with the polluted air and through the eventual effects that this accumulated pollution leads to. So here, breath and breathable worlds are entrenched and also relocated through these particles as they're connected across environments and surface as expressions of inequality. And this has also surfaced in Southeast London, where we've worked, where recently there was an inquest, a second inquest in relation to the death of a 9-year-old Black girl, Ella Kissy Deborah, who died from asthma, and it was ruled that her death could be charged in relation to air pollution. So here are these calls to attend to environmental justice and inequality are very much bound up with the particles of air pollution. So coming to my final particle 3, wildfire smoke. At the same time that viruses, aerosols, particulate matter, tear gas, and ash drifted through the airways of 2020, a blaze of wildfires also converted forests and suburbs into a heady mix of debris, microbes, toxicants, and dust. Fire, made more frequent and intense from climate change, engulfed countries around the world with blood red skies in the west coast of the US, a vast swathe of Australia, as well as parts of India, the Canary Islands, China, the Ukraine, Poland, Scotland, Cyprus, Greece, Turkey, the Amazon, the Pantanal wetlands in Brazil, Spain, Algeria, Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. Of course, citizen sensing devices were able to capture some of this pollution in the particulate matter range, But wildfire smoke also circulates as smaller particles between 0.4 to 0.7 microns, so about 4 to 7 times the size of COVID, along with other microbes, including fungi and bacteria, that could contribute to further illness. So much of what was in the air couldn't be registered by digital devices, but would accumulate in bodies, lungs, soil, and air, forming layers of debris of varying toxicity. The airshows that humans share with, of course, multiple other organisms were also contaminated here, as more than 3 billion animals were displaced in Australia alone through these transformative effects and conditions, changing the possibilities for breathability. So instead of all that is solid melts into air, one could instead ask how these vectors of these 3 particles are settling into breath, and even how all that is airborne transforms the conditions for breathable worlds. Here, thinking about breathability not simply as an essential biological condition, but as the possibility for having exchanges across environments and subjects in ways that could be turned toward reciprocity and mutual benefit. So in this way, how could we consider, as Alexis Pauline Gumbs notes, conditions of breathability as aligning with political possibility, rather than seeing these as merely biological conditions? How could they give rise to other kinds of inhabitations and practices that tune into these accumulated conditions of breathing, but also search for more breathable worlds within and beyond the long 2020?
Thank you. Frederick, it's on you now.
Thank you for inviting me to this conversation on the long 2020. I was interested to hear that it followed conversations you had at C21 on the Anthropocene. Anthropocene was a game that geologists played to date the origins of the impact of the humans on the planet. And the long 2020, I take it as a game with which we are more familiar in humanities, which is to draw a genealogy of a rupture and to do a history of the present. So I'll try to do this, coming back to the moment when something has gone wrong and that led us to where we are now. The emergence of SARS-CoV-2 in 2019 in China has confirmed scenarios built by experts in the 1980s, such as Joshua Lederberg or Samuel Morse, on the emergence of new infectious diseases with very powerful discourses. After the eradication of smallpox, we have never been so vulnerable. We have to prepare for future epidemics. And it was a moment of extension of civil defense techniques of preparedness, such as exercises or drills, to all kinds of hazards after the end of the Cold War as part of a biosecurity apparatus reinforced by 9/11, as we have seen with exercises such as Dark Winter, with the smallpox attack in the streets of New York, and how to use drugs and vaccines to mitigate this outbreak. So that's the first genealogy of the COVID-19 pandemic, going back to this warning in the 1990s. But I want to trace the meaning of SARS-CoV-2 as a warning on environmental changes to a longer genealogy. If bats in China send a virus to humans that spread globally in a few months and causes the interruption of the global economy, this scenario has been written by 3 authors in books published in 1962. And I would like to take the convergence between these 2 books in very different disciplines and very different continents as a sign of something happening in the middle of the 1960s that we have not heard yet. So I want to come back to this year of 1962, in the middle of a period of post-war growth, to ask why these warning signals have not been heard, and why we have developed modes of conception that led us to this disaster. So the first book is Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. Birds have a central place in the trophic chain that incorporates, that is exposed to chemical disruption, such as the spread of DDT, causing cancer among humans. And so nature writing, listening to birds, becomes a way to describe vulnerabilities shared by humans and non-humans in industrial societies. That's a very famous origin of environmental thought in the US particularly. And a lot of us have thought about Silent Spring during this pandemic, as the lockdown has led us to hear birds more clearly when the industrial activities have stopped. But on the same year, there was another book addressed to experts, published by Frank McFarlane Burnett, entitled Natural History of Infectious Diseases. And Frank McFarlane Burnett is one of the founders of this ecology of infectious diseases, thinking about how pathogens emerge when ecosystems are disrupted. And so Burnett, who is an Australian microbiologist and immunologist, thinks about the coevolution between humans and microbes in states of equilibrium or climax. And it tells us that new viruses such as influenza, which he has studied after the Second World War, signal disruptions of ecosystems that have co-evolved for centuries in a state of equilibrium. And he says that we need to use treatments and vaccines to remain in the same place. So it's a kind of game or even fight between nature and humans, where we have constantly to answer back to the signals that nature sends us to remain in the same place, to remain in the state of equilibrium. Now, this idea of an equilibrium has been contested, particularly because of environmental disruptions, such as the livestock revolution, which has increased the number of animals and changed and increased the possibilities of spillover from animal reservoirs to humans. But still, this idea that there is a kind of communication between nature and humans to remain in the same place, that equilibrium is not guaranteed. It's a kind of fight back. It's not a military war, but it's a fighting back and listening to the signals of our partner is still a message that Burnett sends us. And the third reference I wanted to mobilize for the discussion today is Claude Lévi-Strauss, Savage Mind, a book that I've intensively studied, where he says in 1962 that hunting societies have developed modes of classifications of animals and plants that give meaning to unpredictable events at different levels of abstraction, and thus compose very coherent modes of living and thinking environments. While domestication in pastoral societies has led to anticipate events by calculation and statistics, so at a single level of abstraction in a kind of flat ontology, whereas Savage Mind has developed a much more multiple and fragmented way of thinking. And I combine these three references in my book, Avian Reservoirs, to think preparedness not only as a security technique to anticipate unpredictable event or unknown unknowns, but also as a technique of hunting societies built on communication with animals through sentinel devices, that is, animals as sensors on the front line of the battle with emerging viruses, which is also a line of communication with non-humans. And so I argue that we have to imagine future disasters with animals as part of a global community when we cannot calculate the probability of the diseases that come from nature. And that's what I want to bring to the discussion.
Great. Thanks, all of you. This really, I think, opens up a lot of interesting connections. I'm not going to respond formally, clearly. I'm interested to hear what the audience has to say or what each of you have to say to each other. But just to highlight a couple things, I think it's really interesting the way in which all three papers take on both the materiality of bodies, but the materiality then of communication semiotics, whether it's the human body, whether it's animals, as Fred was talking about, whether it's breath, micronic particles, all of these things foreground, I think, in different ways, the body's interaction with the environment and the way in which, as I like to think of it, bodies are mediators and agents of mediation. And I won't rehearse any of the arguments. One thing I will say, though, which was interesting to me in relation to Jennifer's paper, and I suppose I'll, in a kind of selfish way, but I had written something several years ago on mediation and meditation, just a small blog exercise that focused on this question of breathing and focused on the way in which the body took, air in, or whatever it was breathing, the atmosphere, and then through the process of processing it through the bloodstream and so forth, and then exhaled carbon dioxide. And I was just thinking about how mindful meditation, which is actually something that has probably emerged even more strongly during this pandemic as people have tried to deal with these stresses, how that very process of mediation, of meditation itself becomes a process of mediation, a process of transforming, of being aware of your body as it was transforming what you breathed in to what you breathed out. And especially Jennifer's reminder of the various particles, micronic particles that we are constantly breathing in, made it clear that both how COVID is an exception, but also how it's part of this long history that I think all three of you were talking about. So those are just some opening responses. Do we have questions queued, Maureen, or should we turn to the panelists?
Yeah, there are no questions yet. People can feel free to put them in if there are any burning in the back of your minds, but we can open it up now just to the panelists to respond to what you've said.
Or to each other.
Or to each other.
So being in Oregon for my very first time in the season of wildfires, that whole issue of breathing, of course, was so palpable. And again, I think that the kind of speculative practice too about what it was that we were breathing is important. So we were, the wildfires were really close to me. And so what we were breathing houses and cars with all of their chemicals that were, and it was all descending on us in the ashes. And so it would be some trees, but actually a lot of trees don't burn, luckily, but trees, but then also animal bodies, human bodies, cars, buildings, like all of it. Talk about profoundly interconnected with others in the material world. That is what we lived in for about 10 days as it rained down. And that's a really palpable sense of interconnection. But you do have to actually think about it. And I think that what we're set up so much to think of ourselves as completely separate and consumer objects as separate. And so we don't think about those interconnections enough. And I liked Frederick's conclusion there about having to imagine these future disasters. So I kind of have a question just generally to everybody is how do we not move out of 2020 into what we, some nostalgia for the before times without actually learning something from it? And how do we think of all of these disasters that haven't happened that are just around the corner?
I mean, I can jump in there because I partly want to comment on your discussion of what was coming down in the air with all of the burning materials. And I think this speaks to your discussion of transcorporeality, but this is part of my ongoing fascination with particles is because you never quite know what's in the air and you never quite know what particles are composed of. Of course, atmospheric scientists undertake this process called speciation that allows them to understand some of that materiality. But of course, there was COVID attaching to particulate matter, even catching a ride on pollution. So there were all these different ways in which these mixtures were occurring that was really a kind of register of what was in the air in 2020 and how this was quite a distinctive moment. So I think that's a really interesting example that you raised. But this point about the future disaster, I mean, I think this is a really provocative question in many ways because the kind of normal or the nostalgic for the past conditions really would be something perhaps that would itself be a register of privilege. Who would be in a position to want those conditions to return? And for whom would transformation be absolutely crucial? So I think maybe this intersection, this rupture with conditions of inequality have really forced this to the foreground, where it's not possible to think about bodies, environments, disease, and these transformations without also considering the extractive and unequal conditions that have led to this moment and how it does require a transformative response rather than a recuperative one. So I think that would be part of a project of imagining and practicing toward and with the future disaster that is already here. And, as Kyle Powys-White has written, has already occurred for Indigenous people, for instance.
Mm. I wanted to connect the question of breathing, atmosphere, and also fire by returning to the pathogenesis of COVID-19, which is an inflammatory respiratory disease. So the virus replicates in the lung slowly, but the immune response leads to inflammation of the lung, which is then filled with blood, and that's the moment when you literally can't breathe and you choke because your lung is full. And the moment when this inflammation arrives is itself unpredictable, and that's why there are statistics that show inequalities of exposure to COVID-19 based on comorbidity, but doctors who receive patients in reanimation rooms says that they cannot predict based on the patient if this inflammation will happen and how the patient will react. So the patient is faced with his or her own immune system and its capacity to respond to this virus that it has never encountered. So there is a kind of fire inside that has to be mitigated, and the role of the immune system is precisely to calm down this fire by having an early response, and that's the notion of sentinel cells that was very interesting for me in my work when I started to see the analogies made, particularly by Hong Kong biologists, between the idea that Hong Kong is a sentinel post for influenza, because that's where new influenza viruses or coronaviruses are detected, and then also birds, some specific bird species are influenced are sentinels because they are infected before humans, but also some cells play the role of sentinels, and they are called dendritic cells because they have the capacity to capture all kinds of information from all kinds of pathogens, by contrast with other immune cells, such as T cells, which are trained to reply to certain antigenic information. So some cells are programmed for immune response to some pathogens, but dendritic cells are not programmed at all. They are sensitive cells, and so the idea of the pathogenesis of COVID-19 is that when we know that we have been exposed to this kind of viruses, we need to strengthen our sentinel cells in some way, because they are the ones who are able to react not to this virus but to other unknown viruses that will emerge from changing environments, and that's a way also to as you said, forget about innocence and the idea of a world without pathogens. We have encountered pathogens, and that's the immune system is the memory of our previous encounters with pathogens. But we need also some of these immune cells that have the capacity to react to all kinds of pathogens, and that's something that we can develop. And when we see the models that immunologists build to describe this chain of inflammation, it is precisely not a probabilistic model. It's a chain of reaction on it's an image of reactions that resonates with previous catastrophic chains that we have experienced in our life of choking. We know what choking is. I mean, when I read narratives of patients with COVID-19 who choke, I have been infected with COVID-19, but without strong effects. But when I read stories about choking, I could make analogies with previous experiences. So it shows that our immune system and our memory of previous pathologies gives us a sense of how we can react to future emergencies.
Thanks. Before turning it over to questions, Stacy or Jennifer, do either of you have a response to Fred? Or
I mean, I would just like to say quickly, I was really interested in the notion of the warning signal that was running through your work, and how that potentially spoke to Stacy's discussion of ontoepistemologies. How do warnings register? Is it simply a matter of triggering an alert, and that will cascade in a set of adequate responses? Or is there something about that very disjuncture in the question that you asked about the warning signal, and why perhaps there hasn't been an adequate response because the ontoepistemological conditions are not established such that it would be possible to respond to those warnings in ways that would allow conditions to be addressed. So I mean, I wonder about that, because there was something within both of your talks about how risk was being surfaced, and how it was also not adequately responded to. And perhaps there's something there about how to think about the warning signal as something that can be worked with, repurposed, and remade. What counts as a warning for whom? How can we register and rework these warnings?
I would just quickly say that in environmental justice movements, one of the things that they've highlighted is that the sensors for the warning signal are in fact human bodies, often children's bodies, whether it's lead paint or whether it's school contamination, or, you know, in Flint water, the water crisis. It's actually human bodies who are out there taking in the toxins and being probably forever altered by them. And that's actually sort of the way that the EPA works, just as a rule. I mean, with environmental justice issues, it relies upon people saying, look, 50 children in our school somehow all have the same kind of blood cancer. What's up with that? Like, the people are the monitoring devices, and mainly Black people, but other people of color, of course. And, you know, you talked about Silent Spring, Frédéric, and the Latinx migrant workers knew about the dangers of pesticides before Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, long before, because their bodies were out there, they were taking it in. And when they were asked by an interviewer doing a study on something else, they kept saying, look, our people are having miscarriages, we're having all of these diseases, all of these illnesses. And, you know, they weren't even looking for that, right? So human bodies are often the monitors rather than any kind of technical sensor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would add animals also, animals as sentinels. I mean, the way I think about early warning signals really resonates with what Stacy says about the fact that we are inhabiting knowledge. I mean, when I did my research in Hong Kong, I was amazed to see that chickens, who are the most ordinary animals raised for human consumption, were designed as sensors for influenza pandemics. And so the chickens in markets or in farms, some of them were designed as sentinels. They were not vaccinated, so they were the first to carry the virus if the virus entered the farm or the market. And this very simple device, which is a way not to act on an animal, was a way to make it more meaningful among other animals. So this is very similar to what you say about children, and sentinels is often something stigmatizing. It's often, like in Africa, bushmeat hunters are considered as sentinels, or migrant people, because they are more exposed to infectious diseases. But I like to think of sentinel, which is this kind of embodiment of warning signals, also as a way to share vulnerabilities and to be on the front line, to be a kind of avant-garde in the exposure to emerging diseases.
Yeah, I really wanted to just chime in here that I appreciated what Stacy said about needing to hear the reports of migrants or the reports of people of color about the effects on their bodies, because this panel has been great, and this is the kind of work many of us have been doing with the non-human turn, the new materialism and the material turn, to think about the ways in which non-humans signify and have semiotic value as well. But I think we also need to remember that language itself continues to signify, but only as, or maybe most powerfully, as it has a kind of material manifestation. And so you can tell the stories, but if you don't have a venue to hear it, it doesn't become materialized, then language doesn't work. But I think I've been thinking more that this turn away from language that we've been engaged in, I think, for a long time, may need to, like, you know, make a slight detour and return to language, not as immaterial, but actually as part of this whole material array that we've all been talking about. So yeah, appreciate that. So Maureen, you want to take it away?
Sure, we have a really wonderful question from Claire Sagan. I'll just read it. I suppose it would be, so just so that everyone, I'm pretty sure everyone can see it, but I'll just read it so that everyone can hear it. Claire says, thank you so much to you three. A question on temporalities. Jennifer, you so evocatively provoked us to think of breathing as duration and in terms of Black lives and breathable worlds. Stacy, you mentioned surprise and the novel and familiar in this event, and your concept of transcorporeality has been thought of in temporal terms. I'm thinking of Nimani's weathering. Frédéric, your work documents in the midst of such difficulty to think the COVID-19 event, different approaches to anticipate pandemics. And now you've provoked us to turn to an earlier moment, 1962, along with unpredictability and a co-evolutionary view of irises for a longer view of the present. So could the three of you speak more to the question of temporality, particularly of how a sense of urgency and event seems to both prevent and stimulate critical thought in many perhaps contradictory ways? What would and do breathable worlds' temporalities feel and look like? How do we think an event from within it?
I just have a quick response, which is to say that this is just such an important and difficult question, because I think politically we're so geared toward the spectacle, and what Rob Nixon called slow violence is something that is often not captured. And so, I mean, I think that we need, in this era, we need more political activism around what science gets done. Because we won't even know so many things. So you think about something like the Flint water crisis, what will happen to the people 20 years from now, and will we have forgotten that? And how long will the testing of people go on for? It's really hard. And then on the other side, the things that we could be doing now to make productive changes also might take a long time and demand a kind of patience. And yet everything seems so urgent. I mean, to me, I could talk forever about so many different environmental crises and how urgent they are. And then, you know, what can you do with that? I don't know. You also have to put it back in this long frame of, say, of the Anthropocene, which then in some ways, of course, these debates, we've already had a lot of these debates, but then it makes agency seem almost impossible within that huge temporality, and that scale makes it seem impossible for us to act. And yet we need to speculate about that scale and somehow act within it at the same time. So I absolutely cannot answer your question, Claire. So it's too hard. Maybe other people have better answers. I'm frustrated by this one.
Well, I can jump in if Frédéric is not yet going to answer. So I think this is a very important question, and because this is very much a kind of preliminary set of notes in thinking through these particles, I think I should really say more about this notion of breathing as duration, which you pick up. And I think the interesting thing about breathing, of course, is that it is a duration that is centered in the present, but also depends upon inheritance and transformation. And there's something interesting about that sort of temporality that doesn't attempt to be linear, that doesn't attempt to be kind of progression in the usual sense of how modernity, I suppose, has understood time. So it is deeply present in the current moment, but is also relational and dependent on everything that's made that breathing possible. So there's something interesting about that order of temporality that is perhaps a rupture with the usual ways of thinking about urgency and crisis, that doesn't elide questions of urgency, and of course recognizes the quite problematic politics that can emerge in relation to urgency and crisis, but rather inhabits that question differently by being present with these problems, but not assuming that they can be mastered or known from some totalizing position, but have to be worked with and transformed. So I think this is where I work a lot in practice-based research as much as theory, and see practice as a space for generating critical thought that doesn't have to be outside of a problem to work with and understand it. So I think as a kind of onto-epistemological position, this is a way of thinking about duration in a way that resonates with breath, that also seeks out these transformative possibilities by not trying to have a kind of totalizing view, not trying to understand temporalities kind of in the abstract, but as something that's always giving rise to different orders of being.
So Claire's question encourages me to explain further why I chose 1962 as a date illuminating the genealogy of 2020, rather than, for example, 1989 with the publication of the journal Emerging Infectious Diseases. And so it's a game similar to the game of Anthropocene, because I argued in another publication that if we want to understand current pandemic, we need to trace it between two events, which is the Neolithic revolution with the domestication of animals, and the livestock revolution with the increase of the animals raised for human consumption. That tells a lot about a co-evolution. But here I play on a shorter time frame, and the reason why I chose 1962 is I thought a lot about why Levi-Strauss's Savage Mind was very untimely when it was published. I mean, it was considered as the climax as the culmination of the structuralist mode of fashion. But I want to argue that it also resonates with environmental movements and with new trends in ecology of diseases, and also when thinking about the place of the anthropology of hunting societies within French philosophy, I thought a lot about what happened between 1962 and 1968, which is the moment of French theory, when the model of the language as a place precisely of communication was inspiring so many changes and innovations, what was called French theory, and this kind of intellectual revolution was followed by a political revolution with after 1968, and then by a kind of counter-revolution when the neoliberal economy was expanding to the world, and China, that had lived a very different cultural revolution, joined the global economy with a major impact on the global market. And so it's this junction between intellectual revolutions, political revolutions, economic revolutions that led to the moment of awareness of infectious diseases as a sign of these different revolutions occurring at different levels. And so that's why I take 1962 as an index of what happened. And also I think because 1962 for France was the end of the Algerian War, and so the moment when colonization was passed, I mean, and there was the opportunity to start something new, to think in a new way the role of university and academic thinking within a changing world, and this opportunity has been taken precisely by anthropology in comparison with societies that had never been studied in academic institutions, and this small moment of ruptures, I think, has been lost also when economics has taken the path more dominantly, and so taking 1962 as a day to illuminate 2020 was a way to make a detour and introduce the integration of these hunting societies within academic as a way to raise critically environmental questions.
So there are a couple of other questions I wanted to throw in. One is from YouTube and is actually, I think, just a general question. From Elliot Hall, who says, how many categories are used to describe environmental dangers? For example, infectious diseases is one of those. And then we also have a question from Ali Sperling, who later retracted her question, but I think I'm going to throw it in here anyway because I think it is still worth bringing up. But it's related to Claire's earlier question about time and temporality. And Ali says, I have kind of a broad question, but would be interested to hear more about how the speakers are thinking about temporality and the longness of 2020. I hear so often people saying how we are living in such weird times, meaning, people say we're living in unprecedented times, but isn't that also because 2020 revealed what were already overlapping temporalities, simultaneous temporalities of the fast and slow somehow at once, or temporalities in collision? Or another way to think about it, as many of the examples you're talking about with regard to at-risk populations and ecologies, don't we also have to say that the longness of 2020 would feel super contracted to others? For instance, the populations that have been dealing with these vulnerabilities and risks for a long time. I think that's what she's asking.
Absolutely. I think all those are really important points. I love this idea of the overlapping, simultaneous, and even I think it says something like clashing temporalities that we're living in. Because I did have moments where not that I was relieved that all of these horrible things were happening, but there was a sense in which maybe something that many of us had already known was being revealed in a dramatic way, and then perhaps people would do something about it. There was this little moments of hope that those temporalities were suddenly in the moment. If you're an environmentalist and you're projecting forward in all of these events that are extremely probable, if not already just underway in ways that are very difficult to shift, or in terms of, say, Black Lives Matter and that very long temporality of harm, oppression, death, all of those things, and racism that happens in that moment. And it's shown in the media as a moment, as something that happened, but actually, of course, that something in that immediacy has to be understood within such a more lengthy time frame. So yeah, I think that those are all really important points. And we could also think about multi-species temporalities. How bizarre is it for various animals in industrial agriculture to live lives that I would assume are much shorter than what their lives would have been? Animal groups who are going extinct. What about the extinction temporalities? When you throw multi-species perspectives in, the temporalities get even more complicated, I think, to imagine.
Yes, I think this question about what is meant by a long temporality, really, that is provoked by this question is such an important one because it goes in so many different directions. As we've heard, the kind of long crises that have been brewing for a very long time now, but also the ways in which this will continue to inform and shape economies, livelihoods, and so many other aspects of health and disease and environment for a long time to come. It's hard to really even fathom how this will bed in, for instance, COVID as an example, for generations as an endemic disease and what that will look like. How these moments of rupture will also, as I've read in various reporting, are really just the beginning of crises that will accelerate and become much more intensified. So this will seem almost like a moment when things were kicking off and were in many ways much more sort of instigatory than long in many ways. That the long part is still yet to come. But of course, then there's the longness of this year that has this kind of repetition and sameness for some people who are able to work in particular ways, for instance, at home, and the ways in which this incessant screen time that we were talking about when we were just getting on the call has a kind of longness and duration to it that feels unsustainable and really provokes these questions of how it might be possible to live otherwise. Is it possible not to do many of the things that had become customary and ordinary? Is it possible to change these patterns? So is this longness also giving rise to these kind of conflagrations, this kind of quick burst of energy, this spark? I like this idea of fire inside. I wonder if there's also kind of fire inside the time of this moment that means that what is this kind of long kind of spark really is going to lead to something that is a kind of a massive change in the ways in which we inhabit temporalities. And this is inevitably, it's hard not to think of these various calls for slow movements. Of course, there's the slow food, there's slow science, there's many ways in which slowness has been presented as a way in which to address environmental and other crises, to remake economies away from incessant growth, a kind of rampant extractivism, and to rethink toward other temporalities. So is there something about longness that doesn't have to be a kind of punishment or a no exit condition, but could actually reorient toward other ways of thinking about time?
I will take the first question and maybe try to answer the second in passing, which the first question was why, I mean, what are the categories to describe environmental dangers apart from infectious diseases? I mean, this is something that I thought about, why among all the dangers coming from troubled environments, infectious diseases are the most catchy, both for governments and for population, and particularly for journalists, because I think infectious diseases have precisely this mix of quickness and slowness. I mean, because infectious diseases break out very rapidly. So there is this moment of emergence, and you can trace the spillover from animals. And that's the notion of outbreak, which is similarly used for infectious disease and for terrorist attacks, with the idea that something invisible is suddenly becoming visible and producing a massive disaster. And so infectious diseases affect our bodies with this reaction of panic and infection of the lung and so on. But at the same time, infectious diseases spread quite slowly. I mean, we see it with the narrative of expansion to the world, and then treatment, vaccination. All this takes time, and in that sense, facing an epidemic helps us to think in a more long durée. All kinds of other kinds of environmental troubles, such as climate change. I mean, we have used lockdown and suspension of activities as a way to block the circulation of the virus. How could we use that to diminish our ecological footprint? These are questions that have been raised a lot by environmental movements. To what extent are we ready to take for epidemics measures that we expected to do against climate change for a long time? So in that sense, this idea of rapidity and mobilization of the government against an epidemic tells us about what we could do for disasters that occur at a more long duration, with effects that will be visible in future generations, and that's one of the of the lessons of the long 2020s. How can we project ourselves in the 20th century as a century of many environmental disasters on several scales of duration.
Thank you. That's great. I think, well, there was another question that Stacy, oh, she already replied. Well, I'll read it out as well in case others want to discuss it. This is from Lane Hall, who says, capitalism and its extractive nature is clearly a disaster for the world, with emergent totalitarian capitalisms even worse. War is horrible for the environment. The incremental nature of our shifts in consciousness, even within more optimistic regimes, simply seems too small for the nature of the global challenges that we will now face. Do you see any emergent social or governance forms that offer optimism for a future that isn't entirely bleak?
Can I just piggyback on that and ask if you also might see any kind of technical forms that might offer a future? Jennifer, you said you're interested in practice as much as theory, and I was thinking about how we could, would it be possible to create sort of technical forms that would somehow persist in this longue durée, or is in fact this huge temporality mitigating against kind of anything we might build or create? So just not to take away from Lane's, but to add to the question of social or governance forms, also the possibility of technical forms.
I think this is an interesting question about governance, because it often looks at more nation-based ways of thinking about governance. But I think what climate change has really shown, perhaps through the failure of certain forms of governance in the last 4 years, is the ways in which other units of governance can really emerge in this space, in this kind of political vacuum of sorts, to create other ways of addressing these crises. So the obvious example with climate change has been city-based forms of governance, where many cities have undertaken all sorts of forms of experimentation in terms of remaking urban fabric, creating different kinds of infrastructures and support systems, to really be able to test and try out and build other ways of living, and also different forms of accountability that in some cases have used technologies. Although I think here the question I would raise is, what is meant by the technical? How is the technical also remade and reworked, not as an artifact, but as a set of relations and materialities that can be differently configured? So I'm interested in, for instance, with sensors, of thinking of these not just as a device that cues into certain kinds of pollutants, but that can activate different socio-ecological ways of operating. So I think those would be the spaces, the kind of intersections that could be interesting to explore. Specifically, I don't have specific examples, for instance, of a test bed in such and such location, but everywhere from London to Chicago to really Delhi, I think there are examples taking place around the world of cities in particular trying out different ways of addressing traffic problems, air pollution, green infrastructure, different ways of thinking about water, and different ways of really thinking about arrangements of work, economies, livelihoods that are situated, but really rethinking the local as well, because it's not as though these are experiments that are separated off from other cities around the world. So what's interesting about these forms of governance is that they're also very much in communication and part of a kind of international or internationalism that doesn't settle within what is perhaps a somewhat moribund unit of governance in the form of the nation that is really in the throes of being reworked, and we're seeing all the fallout from that.
I'll just quickly say that one of the things that does make me hopeful is the idea of multi-species design. So whether it be in cities, making room for other species in cities, or whether it's the movement to make your backyard, instead of a dead, lifeless lawn, a habitat for other creatures, or in England with what are those little critters, that little hedgehogs, right? How they're going door to door to try to get people to make little holes in their walls so that the hedgehogs can actually move about and survive. And so thanks to Claire Sagan here for urging me to respond better to the question than I did originally, which is to say I basically have no hope, which is also true. But there is this book, Designs for the Pluriverse, which I love. And Escobar says, how do we develop forms of knowing that do not take words and beings and things out of the flow of life? He says, design can then become an open invitation for us all to become mindful and effective weavers of the mesh of life. And that sense, like Jennifer was saying about practice and thinking within practices, I think that is something that makes me very hopeful, because even if it's doomed, you do it anyway. You know, even if I don't help anything by converting my entire lawn into a multi-species habitat, you still do it. You just keep doing the things.
Thank you. And I wanted to pick up on something that you had mentioned earlier in your discussion, in your presentation, Stacy, that hasn't quite been touched on yet in our conversation together. But you had mentioned at the beginning the need for, I mean, you didn't use the word science communication, but really better frameworks for the public for understanding how to think about these overlapping crises. And when Jennifer was responding to the last question about cities that have been creating kind of like car-free zones, my mind went there too. And I was thinking about how I have seen reporting on, in particular, the air quality in Delhi, and how during the lockdown, air quality in Delhi increased dramatically. But the reporting on it was framed as like, before the pandemic, there was a pandemic's worth of deaths all the time because of the air quality in Delhi. So it's allowed us in some ways the opportunity to reframe the longer term crises that were simply invisible perhaps, or not reported on in the same way. And the pandemic has given reporters and journalists and, you know, public facing intellectuals the opportunity to like apply that backwards to reframe the urgency of some of these longer term and chronic problems that we've been dealing with. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's really great. I love the idea of taking the crisis, but then making it backwards towards something that's more diffuse and then unseen. And of course, most of my work has been about chemicals and toxins in terms of environmental health and environmental justice. And this is just a constant problem. And I think that one of the problems with climate change being at the forefront is that all of our attention is now, okay, climate change, but these things all interact, like especially with the wildlife. I mean, you can't just focus on one of these issues. And I think something like C21 and academic thought in general, I mean, we are challenged, I think, to think through more transdisciplinary modes of work and thought and events, and pushing our universities not to be so siloed, because almost any of these problems that we're faced with right now are so entirely interwoven. I mean, the social justice issues in the pandemic, I think, caught so many people by surprise. Like, why would a virus hit this group of people more than this group of people? I mean, because those are separate things. Like, that's health and disease and a virus over there. And then, oh yeah, that race and social justice, that has nothing to do with each other. Like, how we think these things together is such a challenge for all of us, I think.
I will answer the question of optimism at three scales. So first, at the community level, I was also very pleased with modes of organization of gardens with permaculture, people rediscovering their capacity to grow food by themselves and sharing earth full of microbes at a time of increased hygiene was very thrilling. And then at the national level, I was pleased to see that the language of viruses has been, viruses and epidemics has been diffused in the media in a very pedagogical way. I mean, we all started to become experts in variants and rate of reproduction, and these are knowledges that we take from experts and that become our way to talk about the present and about also environmental changes. And so it's a language that I had discovered 10 years ago when I started to work on the pandemic preparedness, but I think it's really one of the languages that we need to appropriate to think about the present. And then at a more global level, I feel very pleased by the fact that Taiwan has become the model of the management of this epidemic, because despite the fact that it was so close to China, it could control the epidemic at a very early stage without using massive measures of lockdown and respecting individual liberties. And when you think that Taiwan is at the border between China and the US in this kind of new Cold War that is emerging, and that Taiwan is not even a member of the World Health Organization, whereas it has taken exemplary measures. I mean, this really confirms my idea that we need to learn from sentinels, and there are some territories that play the role of sentinels, and Taiwan is a multicultural democratic society. So at the global level, I mean, we have all done pretty bad in face with this epidemic, but there are some places in the world where it's worth observing and learning, and then we can spread the information and at different levels.
Great, thank you. We're a bit over time, so I think we should release our captive attendees. I want to thank everybody for their really beautiful and insightful talks today. The conversation as well was beautiful and insightful, so I thank you. And thank you to all who attended. The questions were great. We look forward to future Long 2020 talks. Our next one is not this Tuesday, but the following Tuesday, and the information is on our website, uwm.edu/C21. Thank you, everybody.